Okay, I think we're good to go. Great. So hello and very warm welcome to everyone who has joined our webinar today. My name is Eileen Townsend. I'm Head of Standards Policy and Organisational Development at IAASA, and it's a pleasure to have so many of you here with us today. In particular, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to the IAASB team and express our gratitude to them for their support in facilitating the webinar and, of course, providing their time and expertise to take us through the key facets of the draft ISSA 5000 on general requirements for sustainability assurance. So if I may introduce Josephine Jackson, the Vice Chair of the IAASB and Chair of the IAASB Sustainability Task Force. Welcome, Josephine. We're delighted to have you and your team here to present to us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Eileen. And hello, everyone. And thank you again from us in participating in today's webinar on our proposed standard. Obviously, today's webinar is integral to achieving high quality standards because your feedback and insights in the consultation process are critical to the development of the final standard, and a final standard that's going to be comprehensive, that supports consistent high quality engagements, and of course, therefore underpins the trust and confidence in sustainability reporting, because that's really what it's all about. So today you are in very good hands with our IAASB staff. You can see here in order of speaking, we have Tokozani, so TK for short. Then we have Dan, and we have Fadi, there he is, and we have our superstar Armand keeping us all in line in the background. He's not on, but he's there. So before I hand over to TK, though, I just wanted to say a few words about the standard to start us off, warm us up, I guess, if you like. So if we could just move to the next slide. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. So, so we believe that our objective to develop a global baseline standard for sustainability assurance is actually a shared objective, as I was just saying. And it is urgent because we know that there are many jurisdictions where sustainability reporting and assurance is coming into play, and very soon, particularly the European Union. So the IAASB has been working at warp speed in standard setting terms to make this exposure draft available as quickly and as soon as we could. Now, in developing the standard, we have also had the benefit of close consultation with global organisations, including securities regulators, so that's IOSCO and the Financial Stability Board, and of course other international regulatory organisations such as IFIA, as well as our sister board, IAASB. Now, we've also worked with 2 assurance professional working groups as we've gone through the process of developing the standards. So one is accounting firm practitioners and the other is non-accounting firm practitioners, because we're obviously trying to focus on making sure that, consistent with our other assurance standards, that this is profession agnostic. We've also engaged with our international reporting standard setters as well for sustainability, such as IAASB, GRI, and of course we have also engaged with EFRAG. And we've engaged with other organisations such as ISO and accountability. Now, we know that the proposed standard is not yet a finished project, I was going to say project, same thing. And it is for that reason we've launched this global outreach activity in order to engage with as wide a range of stakeholders as possible. Now, as you can see from this slide, we wanted to make sure that we built on our foundational principles already in practice today. And TK is going to talk more about this in a little bit, but we're not actually changing the global assurance model, don't worry, but we are giving it a very, very clear sustainability lens. Now, we also recognise that the global baseline is critical for today, but there is likely to be a call in time for greater specificity than a global baseline standard can offer. So we have built in the likelihood of possible future projects that will provide that specificity. Now, where that may go, we're not quite sure yet, so we want to hear from others. So it could be, for example, specific to the engagement process, so perhaps materiality, or it could be something to do with the subject matter. So it could be, you know, a deeper dive in dealing with biodiversity evidence gathering, as an example. So, you know, it'll be interesting to hear what our stakeholders have to say in terms of future projects. But anyway, I could talk for hours about this. So on that note, it's probably a good time to hand over to TK, and he's going to talk us through the focus and origins of the standard. So TK, thank you. Over to you now.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, Josephine. Yeah, I am TK Togozani, and I'll be going through the background and the development. Thanks, Armand. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's the one. So this slide just represents the key parts of the standard and the scope of the standard. So I'll just talk through all of them in detail, and that should be, I'll cover that, right. So in terms of the scope of the standard is suitable for use with all sustainability topics and aspects of topics or information about those topics, as they're referred to in ED 5000. As an overarching standard, it was very important that the standard stands alone. So unlike our other assurance standards, there's no need to go back and forth between the standard and IAASB 3000 revised to understand the foundational principles of how to perform an audit an assurance engagement, and to understand the fundamental principles and how to perform the engagement. In terms of, so stepping back, ED 5000 has also been written to be framework neutral and topic neutral, which means it can be applied to whichever framework an entity chooses to apply. So for example, it could be applied to the ESRS's, IAASB standards, or in some engagements, a framework that's developed by the company being assured, right? But just like our other assurance standards, ED 5000 is written to be profession agnostic. So as Josephine mentioned, it can be applied by professional accountants and non-accountant assurance practitioners. It was also important that the standard can be applied to both limited and reasonable assurance engagements and a combination of the two. And Dan will give more details on this later on. In terms of the fundamental premises of our standards, under the IAASB standards, so audit and assurance, including ISA 3000 revised and ISA 3410, members of the engagement team are subject to the provisions of the ethics code and the quality management standards. So all other professional requirements or requirements in law regulation that are as least as demanding. And because these are fundamental premises, they've also been reflected in ED 5000. In terms of quality management, ED 5000 has adopted applicable requirements in ISO 220 revised that relate to the overall responsibilities of the engagement leader to manage the quality of an audit or assurance engagement, including the direction, supervision of the members of the engagement team and the review of their work. And finally, on this slide, we've written the standard to be principles-based. However, it still provides sufficient detail to drive consistency in the conduct of sustainability assurance engagements, regardless of the size of the entity or the complexity, and to address the challenges that we know the practitioners are facing in these engagements. Next slide, please, Armand. On this slide, we have a puzzle that just reflects the different material we've used, so that's IAASB material to develop ED 5000. The starting point was definitions. So the Sustainability Assurance Task Force identified definitions in ISA 3000 revised and ISA 3410 that were relevant for this kind of engagement. And we've adapted those definitions and terms for a sustainability assurance engagement. The next step was to look at the requirements and application material in 3000 and 3410. And we've identified the most relevant requirements in those standards. And we've also adapted those for a sustainability assurance engagement. We've also looked at the ISAs, and the ISAs are quite broad and they've been around for years. So these were considered only in the context of them being appropriate for an overarching standard like ED 5000 and their relevance to a sustainability assurance engagement. The ISAs also reflect our latest thinking as the IAASB, as they've been revised more recently than 3000 and 3410. So we have borrowed from those. So an example of how we've leveraged that material is we've used material from ISA 720 to create or develop the section on other information in ED 5000. Last but not least, we've also looked at the ER guidance, which we've heard a lot of good news from practitioners about. And this has also been reviewed, and material has been adapted from the guidance to form requirements and application material in ED 5000. And that covers the background and how we built the standard. And I'll be handing over to Dan Montgomery to take us through the priority areas of ED 5000. So thank you.
Well, thank you, TK, and greetings, everyone. I'm Dan Montgomery, and I serve as a consultant to the IAASB and staff. I actually was a board member for 6 years and served as deputy chair for 3 years, but now I have the pleasure to be the co-lead for the Sustainability Assurance Project with my colleague, Claire Grayston, and happy to do a little bit of a deeper dive here on some priority areas in the standard. If we could move to the next slide. And so I have the privilege, I'll say, of trying to get about 20 minutes worth of content into about 10 minutes to give you a snapshot of some of the key areas here. And I'm going to start with these priority areas that are spelled out in the project proposal, and they're discussed in more detail in the explanatory memorandum to the exposure draft. So you can check that out in section 1F of the explanatory memo. These are key areas for which stakeholders thought that more specific requirements and guidance was needed, and present the areas of greatest challenge in a sustainability assurance engagement. So let's start with limited and reasonable assurance. TK already noted that the standard has been written to address both limited and reasonable assurance. But one thing that was clear from stakeholders was that it was important to clearly distinguish between limited and reasonable assurance in the standard, especially in relation to the practitioner's work effort. So as you all know, this is particularly important as assurance on sustainability information is either being explored or mandated in many jurisdictions around the world, and some, like the Europe, are requiring limited assurance initially, with a shift perhaps to reasonable assurance sometime in the future. So consistent with ISAE 3000, and even more so in terms of the level of specificity with ISAE 3410, the distinctions between limited and reasonable are highlighted throughout the standard, but particularly you will see them in the sections related to the work effort for risk identification and assessment and responses to risks. And one of the ways this is being done in the standard is through signposting. So just like it was done in 3000 and 3410, there are certain requirements that are presented side by side in a table format to highlight the differences. Sometimes those are conditional requirements for either limited or reasonable. In other cases, there's similar requirements, but the nature and extent of the work effort is distinguished in the application material. And then you will notice that paragraphs in the standard may have been designated with an L or an R to signpost what the relationship to either limited or reasonable assurance. And if there's no designation, then it applies to both. The next two pieces of this puzzle here are closely related, and it gets back to the preconditions for accepting or continuing an assurance engagement. And that one of the preconditions is that the criteria to be used are suitable and will be available to intended users. Now, 5000 has been developed to be framework neutral, so it can be used for sustainability information prepared using any suitable criteria, whether it's a framework, a reporting framework, or entity developed criteria, or both. And ISSA 3000 has quite an extensive amount of application material on the characteristics of suitable criteria that builds on what you would have seen in ISAE 3000. Now, we mentioned that the standard is framework neutral, but we have picked up on some important concepts from some of the reporting frameworks, recognized frameworks out there, like the ISSB standards, GRI, and of course from the CSRD and the related assurance requirements in the ESRSs. So one of those concepts that you will see relates to management's process for determining the topics to be reported. And this is referred to in a number of different ways in different frameworks, including materiality process or materiality assessment. And the ISSA 5000 touches on this materiality process. Certainly it recognizes that the framework might require such a process, but it also then deals with the practitioner's consideration of that process in different parts of the standard, starting with acceptance and continuance and the assessment of the suitability of criteria. It runs through planning and understanding the system and understanding controls as part of the risk process, and then extends all the way through to performing procedures, making sure that management has applied those criteria properly, and then certainly when the practitioner evaluates identified misstatements. So one thing to point out, though, and I will touch on this a little bit more in a moment, is that this management process is different from the practitioner's materiality. You'll note on the slide here, there's a reference to double materiality, and the reporting framework may also require the application of that concept. So both financial materiality and impact materiality, or both. And when it's required by the framework, then the entity's materiality process needs to consider both aspects. And the practitioner actually would apply a double materiality lens in making materiality judgments, including when evaluating the effect of uncorrected misstatements. With respect to scope, to provide a basis for determining whether the preconditions for the engagement are met, ISSA 5000 requires a preliminary knowledge of engagement circumstances, and that includes both the sustainability information expected to be reported, that's the link back to the materiality process, and the scope of the engagement. And you'll see in paragraph 4 of the standard that the scope can extend to all of the sustainability information reported or only part of that. Now, the scope of the engagement, including whether the practitioner is going to issue an assurance conclusion on the entirety of the information or separate conclusions for different disclosures. The scope is important because it affects various aspects of the engagement, including the materiality judgments, the risk procedures, further procedures to respond to risks, and of course, evaluating misstatements, and then ultimately the reporting and the form and content of the report in the assurance conclusion. With respect to evidence, the IAASB determined that a principles-based approach was appropriate in ISSA 5000 for requirements related to evidence, given the wide-ranging nature of sustainability disclosures. The requirements and guidance incorporate some of the latest thinking of the board from the Audit Evidence Project, for example, relating to sources of information and the relevance and reliability of information intended to be used as evidence. Also addresses some challenges in evidence gathering relating to qualitative and forward-looking information, as well as measurement uncertainty for estimates. Regarding the system of internal control, as part of performing risk procedures, the standard requires an understanding of internal control for both limited and reasonable assurance, but if you will, it's more limited for limited assurance. It only requires an understanding of certain components, control environment, the information system, and the results of the risk assessment process, whereas there's a requirement for a deeper understanding of the components of internal control for reasonable assurance, as there, in the first instance, it might be necessary to have that deeper understanding to be able to assess risks of material misstatement at the assertion level. And then secondly, there might be a greater expectation that the practitioner would be obtaining evidence by testing operating effectiveness of internal controls for a reasonable assurance engagement. Now, the differentiation between limited and reasonable is consistent with ISAE 3410, but there's more application material to deal with a broader set of subject matter, obviously, for sustainability information. And there is an acknowledgement that, for certain entities, the processes and controls will maybe be immature at this point, will continue to evolve, and that is something that the practitioner needs to keep in mind in obtaining the understanding of controls. Finally, the last piece of the puzzle here is materiality. And I don't need to tell you that materiality is just more complex for a sustainability assurance engagement than it is for most financial statement audits. Their challenges arise from the fact that sustainability information may be measured in different units. There are different sustainability matters, a mix of quantitative and qualitative or narrative information, maybe a mix of historical and forward-looking information. So for these reasons, coming up with materiality judgments can be challenging. And you may, in fact, have multiple materialities for different disclosures or groups of disclosures. Now, the standard is clear that materiality is a matter of professional judgment, and that it's not affected by the level of assurance. So because materiality is based on the information needs of users, the materiality really is looked at the same way for either a limited assurance or reasonable assurance engagement. I did mention earlier that the practitioner's materiality is different from management's materiality process. Management's process is focused more on the matters to report and how to report them. Practitioners' materiality judgments are focused on a threshold of significance to user decision-making that's applied in planning and performing procedures throughout the engagement. So the nature of sustainability information makes it impractical, really, to set a single materiality threshold for the information as a whole. So the ISSA 5000 uses what we call a bifurcated approach to materiality. So actually determining a materiality, including a performance materiality for quantitative disclosures, and then considering materiality for qualitative disclosures, and for both there are factors to consider that actually would apply not only to setting materiality, but also when concluding whether a material misstatement exists. This is an area where questions are coming up repeatedly in all of our outreach, the webinars, the roundtables, and we are working on some Q&As that hopefully will address some of these questions, but we do expect to get further questions on materiality through the comment letter process and through the course of our outreach up to and to the point of the closure of the comment period. So if we could pop to the next slide, just some quick reminders about a few other key areas that are addressed in proposed ISSA 5000. First, on definitions, and with respect to engagement leader, I only want to point out that this is the equivalent of engagement partner in ISQM1 and ISA 220, the auditing standards and the quality management standards. And we actually went with engagement leader to be more all-encompassing, recognizing that the legal nature of an organization performing these engagements can take many forms, and wanted the standard to be as profession agnostic as possible. With respect to sustainability information, there were a lot of discussions about this particular term, and we've had some ongoing dialogue also with our colleagues at the ethics board, since they're actually coming up with a term for sustainability information as well. But there are three closely related terms: sustainability information, sustainability matters, and disclosures. And I would point you to section 1E of the explanatory memo and appendix 1 in the standard that explains the relationship of those three terms. But in simplest terms, sustainability information is information about sustainability matters, and sustainability matters can be include a broad range of environmental, social, economic, cultural topics, and as TK mentioned earlier, information about aspects of those topics. And to keep in line with our foundational assurance concepts, sustainability information is the equivalent of subject matter information in the assurance standards, and sustainability matters is the equivalent of underlying subject matter. With respect to fraud and professional skepticism, the topic of fraud, including greenwashing, is top of mind for many stakeholders. There's a recognition in the standard that the reporting of sustainability information and the underlying systems and controls are continuing to develop and mature, as I mentioned, and that might increase the susceptibility of sustainability information to misstatements due to fraud. And so fraud and professional skepticism are addressed throughout the requirements and application material in the standard, starting with the definition of misstatement, and it runs through various stages of the engagement for designing and performing procedures and actions for the practitioner to respond to any identified or suspected fraud. This is, there's further explanations and examples that are provided both in the explanatory memo as well as certainly as the application material in the standard. Lastly, I wanted to touch on groups, because there have been a number of questions that have come up about how ISSA 5000 might apply to either group sustainability information or what some are calling consolidated sustainability information. Now, the IAASB considered the manner and extent to which 5000 should address groups, and recognize that sustainability reporting frameworks may require sustainability disclosures to be for the same reporting entity, so it could apply to groups. But the IAASB's view was that the principles-based requirements in the standard are capable of being applied for any assurance engagement, and that they already encompass the key principles in the auditing standard for groups, ISA 600 revised, and that's looking at the information to be reported, what the locations are, could be from multiple sources, including from entities in the value chain, determining the approach, where evidence needs to be obtained and by whom, and whether that means that experts or other practitioners may need to be involved. And then certainly the guiding principle that the engagement leader needs to be sufficiently and appropriately involved throughout the engagement with respect to direction, supervision, and review of the work performed. So there are several references in ISSA 5000 to groups and consolidated sustainability information, and examples of how the standard might be applied in those circumstances. As Josephine mentioned earlier, the IAASB also will entertain input from stakeholders in terms of separate ISSAs that might be needed down the line. And one of those, in fact, may need to address groups. And the explanatory memorandum has a separate question to get the views of stakeholders in this regard. So I will stop and turn it over to my colleague Fadi, who's going to take us down the road on a few other aspects of the standard. Fadi?
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. Hi all. My name is Fadi Mansour. I'm a senior manager at the IAASB, and I'm happy to be presenting today. Today I'm going to walk you through some other concepts of ISA 5000, including misstatement, other information, communication, and reporting. I don't know if we can go to the next slide, please. So we're starting with material misstatements and other information. So ISA 5000 addresses the concept of misstatements in the sustainability information, as well as the misstatement identified in other information. The definition of in ISA 5000, I'm gonna start again as Josephine indicated. In terms of the material misstatements, the ISA 5000 addresses the concept of misstatements in the sustainability information as well as the other information. Other information will be covered a bit in detail in a while. So in ISA 5000, the definition notes that misstatement can be qualitative or quantitative, and the misstatement can arise from fraud or from error. In evaluating the misstatement, the practitioner has to go into two steps. First, he accumulates and accumulates the misstatement identified through the engagement, throughout the engagement. Then he will evaluate whether these uncorrected misstatements are material, either individually or in aggregate. So in an audit of financial statement engagement, the evaluation of the misstatement is generally straightforward. However, in a sustainability assurance engagement, this can be quite challenging for several reasons, such as is the practitioner issuing a conclusion on the entire sustainability information or separate conclusion on different disclosures. There is a mix of qualitative and quantitative disclosures. And also, let's not forget about estimates and forward-looking information. So there are lots of complexities for the practitioner to deal with. In developing the requirement of ISA 5000 in connection with the evaluation of misstatement, the board initially looked to ISAE 3000 revised, 3410, and the ER guidance as a starting point. The board then also looked into ISA 450 for additional guidance. As you can see on the slides, the evaluation of misstatement starts at the disclosure level. Let's take an example. In a disclosure about work-related injury, the practitioner identifies one or more misstatements. If the practitioner is issuing a separate conclusion on the disclosure work-related injuries, then the practitioner needs to assess whether uncorrected misstatements are material individually or in aggregate to this particular disclosure. Another example would be like if the work-related injuries is part of a broader disclosure about, let's say, occupational health and safety, and the practitioner is providing a conclusion on the sustainability information related to the occupational health and safety, then the practitioner should evaluate all misstatements identified, including those specific or related to the work-related injuries. If these misstatements are material, again, individually or in aggregate, the practitioner is always required to assess the misstatement, individual or in aggregate. Again, this is not an easy task for the practitioner, as it can involve considerable judgment by the practitioner. Moving to the right side of the slide, the other information. Other information is any information included in a document or documents containing the sustainability information subject to the assurance engagement. Also, sustainability information, as you all know, may be presented together with the audited financial statement, such as in an annual report. In this case, the audited financial statement will be considered the other information for the purposes of ISA 5000. So why are we talking about other information? Why other information is important? Well, there is always the risk that the sustainability information may be presented with other information that is inconsistent with the sustainability information, which is subject to the assurance. So again, as you can see, on the slide, ISSA 5000 requires the practitioner to read and consider other information available prior to the date of the assurance report. the board discussed this and did not consider appropriate to require the practitioner to consider other information which will be available after the date of the assurance report, i.e., like similar to the requirement of ISA 720 for listed entities. In the board's view, this would be very onerous. And however, the board also feels that this will not preclude the practitioner from doing so if he decides to consider other information after the date of the assurance report. When other information is misstated, a misstatement of the other information exists when the other information is either incorrectly stated or is misleading. So, and if the practitioner concludes that a misstatement exists in the other information, he will request management to correct it. ISA 5000 includes requirement on the appropriate action to be taken by the practitioner in case the misstatement remains uncorrected. Also, there is a requirement for the practitioner to state in the other information section of the assurance report, which we'll be talking about in the next slide, that there is an uncorrected mistake. He should state in the other information section that there are uncorrected misstatement in the other information, and he should describe this misstatement. So, Armand, if we can move to the next slide, please. Okay. The next slide is about communication and reporting. First, we're tackling communication with management, those charged with governance, and other parties. So ISSA 5000 requires the practitioner to determine whether there are significant matters to be communicated with management or those charged with governance. On the slides, you can see some example of significant matters like identified or suspected fraud or non-compliance with laws and regulation, identified deficiencies in the internal control, and so on. These are considered as high-level requirement in ISA 5000, so which are around communication for those charged with governance. These requirements are consistent with ISAE 3000 revised. However, the board also is interested in the stakeholders' views on this topic or area, and whether stakeholders consider there is a need for further detail to be added to ISA 5000, and what are the potential types of matters that may be communicated other than those mentioned in ISA 5000. Moving on to the reporting piece. Again, the reporting requirements are based on ISAE 3000 revised 3410 and draw on the EAR guidance. However, in thinking about the format and the content of the sustainability assurance report, the board also considered feedback from the post-implementation review of the auditor's reporting standard ISA 700 revised. This feedback indicated that there is a need to align the assurance report with the auditor's report on the financial statement. So the board incorporated a few elements of the auditor's report into the report for sustainability assurance engagement. We're gonna, for example, some of the examples like the ordering of the report elements, and now the conclusion or the opinion comes first, then it is followed by the basis or conclusion or opinion. There is also an explicit statement about independence and other ethical responsibility. There is a requirement to include the name of the engagement leader when we're issuing a sustainability assurance report for a listed entity. And also, as mentioned in the previous section, there is a separate section for other information. As a reference, Appendix 2 of the exposure draft includes 4 illustrations on on the assurance report for sustainability assurance engagement. Just a final point from my side on the reporting of the assurance report. The board discussed the pros and cons of including the equivalent of key audit matters, CAMs, something like key sustainability assurance matter. The board acknowledged the potential public benefits of having CAMs in the sustainability report, but also considered the feedback on the auditor's reporting post-implementation review, which again indicated that the stakeholders are not very supportive of having CAMs in other assurance reports. The board also considers other factors and on balance decided not to require communications of CAM in ISA 5000 as an overarching standard, but will consider addressing this in future ISSAs. And as Dan mentioned, the board is definitely interested in hearing stakeholder views on several topics, including the CAM, and the board also has included a specific question in the EM. This is all from my part. Thank you again, and sorry for the technology glitch. And I hand over again to Josephine for the remainder of the session. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Fadi. As I say, I actually thought it was my sheet, so I was desperately trying to get it to work again, but glad to have you back online. I just want to talk a little bit about next steps. Probably most of you will already know this, but if we could move to the next slide, please, Arman. As you will know, we issued the consultation on the 2nd of August. Actually doesn't feel that long ago, but we're almost now into 2 months, which time does fly by, doesn't it? And then we have a comment period up until the 1st of December. But we also have, along with our normal exposure draft, explanatory memorandum and questions there, we've also launched a survey, a more targeted survey for preparers, also reporting standard setters, those charged with governance, investors and so forth, which doesn't have quite so many questions and has some brief information about the standard to help them with the questions that are in there. So those stakeholders of ours who are attending today who might not necessarily want to respond to the exposure draft itself, please do have a look at that survey. In terms of the approval period for the final standard, we're still aiming, again, in that warp speed fashion for September 2024. There is an urgent need out there. And we're looking currently, or we've proposed currently, to have an 18-month implementation period, but we've already heard requests for early adoption, which we totally understand. So in terms of that 18-month implementation period, that would make the standard officially effective for about 2026. But again, you know, that's obviously to be concluded as we work through the process. Our oversight body, the PIOB, also have to go through their own due process, and that usually takes anywhere from 2 to 3 months. So effectively, we would like to see that standard ready in final form in December 2024. So if we could move to the next slide, please. As I mentioned right at the beginning, lots of outreach activity behind this consultation. In terms of roundtables, we've got 8 roundtables. We had one in New York last week. Next week, we'll be looking to Brussels, Kuala Lumpur, Japan, and then the following week will be Australia, and then we've got Sao Paulo and Africa and Canada. But of course, we also have some FAQs coming up, and there are some other webinars that we've already concluded, so you can get access to those. The webinars that we've done actually are in terms of what we call the global webinars. They're a lot more of a deeper dive in some of the technical aspects. So those of you who want to just have a little bit more information and we've talked about today, then by all means, you can get those on YouTube. They're very easy to access. And then, of course, we'll also have some face-to-face focus groups and other meetings such as this. And we'll be doing some other jurisdictional events and meeting with regulators, standard setters, as well as we pop to these various different countries and jurisdictions and cities. So apologies, I was actually so excited for us to update you on the standard. I skipped happily along through the agenda without giving Eileen a chance to actually set the scene. So Eileen, really huge apologies. I'm going to pop back to you for now. Thank you.
No problem at all, Josephine. In fact, the main purpose of the webinar is to enhance all our understanding of the draft ISSA 5000, and thank you to you and your team for really valuable pointers on where the key aspects of it are. But and I'm going to encourage everybody to get into the Q&A. If you do have questions, it's a good opportunity, so please do put your question in the Q&A function there. But I do want to pass to my colleague Aoife Warren, who is going to just give some Irish context on the sustainability assurance in Ireland, and note as well, actually, as Aoife's getting ready there, that we are recording this because we think that it can be a key resource for Irish stakeholders. Whether you're a practitioner or a preparer, a user, indeed a regulator. So this will be available as a resource on our YouTube channel afterwards. But Aoife, if you might just say, before we get into Q&A, if you might just give some Irish context to the sustainability assurance. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Eileen. And the other thing I'd just like to remind people of as well is that if you click on the bottom of your screen, you'll see there is a Q&A option. So if you have any questions for any of the panelists, you might pop them in there and we'll endeavour to answer them in the next few minutes. But just getting back to the situation regarding sustainability assurance in Ireland at the moment, starting with large public interest entities in 2024 and then extending to all large companies by 2028. The European Corporate Sustainability Directive, or CSRD for short, requires companies to publish information on social, economic, governance matters in accordance with the mandatory European sustainability reporting standards, and also then to obtain assurance on that information. Initially, that information will be limited assurance, and in that regard, the CSRD states that the European Commission is to adopt European-wide limited assurance standards for in this area by October 2026, and it then goes on to say that by 2028 the Commission may adopt reasonable assurance standards. This is subject to a feasibility study, and reasonable assurance would be the equivalent of the assurance provided by auditors on financial statements. So in terms of transposition, EU countries have until July of next year to transpose the CSRD into their national law. And then the first tranche of companies impacted will be obliged to publish their sustainability information and the related assurance report in early 2025. So as most of you are probably aware, earlier this year, the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment held a public consultation on various options in the CSRD, following which they've indicated that it's auditors who have been appropriately authorised who will be able to provide sustainability assurance in Ireland. This may be extended in time to non-auditors, and in this regard, the Department have indicated that they intend to issue a further consultation next year on that topic. The Department has also indicated that until the EU adopt, or the European Commission adopts standards for assurance on a European-wide basis, IAASA will have the power to adopt Irish standards. And over the last year, we've been working closely with our European colleagues, and we'll continue to do so in this area. And it's likely that any standard adopted will reflect ISSA 5000. So with that, I'll hand back to Eileen for Q&A. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Aoife. Aoife, one of the questions in the Q&A was about whether non-accountants would be assuring, but I think you've just answered that one.
But it might be. It's always a good one to respond to anyway, because that is definitely the case. In fact, actually, sometimes I think there was so much focus on the standard being practitioner agnostic by IOSCO, our global securities regulator, that I think along the way it was slightly lost that our assurance standards are already profession agnostic. So we've just built on that, that foundation, because it recognizes with the assurance standards, we have to recognize that there is subject matter there that is not necessarily as well known to accounting firms as it is perhaps to some experts in other organizations. And so what you're looking to have is an engagement team that has the exact mix of resource and subject matter expertise in order to deliver that, that high quality engagement. And so even though our standards are already profession agnostic, we have actually added some material in the standard, just so that perhaps, from the perspective of somebody who's familiar with assurance, but not necessarily with some of our terms, the alphabet soup, as people refer to it in a meeting we had yesterday, we've tried to make those as clear as possible and offered guidance where we think, well, maybe that's not quite so easy to understand if you're in a non-accounting firm. But that's been the benefit of having that reference group who aren't from accounting firms, who are doing assurance activities and performing assurance under, say, 3,000 today. They're able to help us identify where we might need some more examples, where we might need to actually maybe change some of our phraseology. And so we have certainly put a lot more material in than we would normally in that regard. And hopefully, we really want to hear from, the traditional non-accounting firms as well in this regard to help us when we're bringing this standard to its conclusion as a final standard. The other thing I would say as well is that, inevitably with all our standards, we just have to get that balance right between the requirements, the material, which we call the application material, which help you as a professional accountant determine, using your judgment, how best to achieve that objective by thinking about, the nature of procedures and varying those procedures. There is that. So that's what, that's part of the role of the application material. But then some of it becomes educational material. And, getting that balance right between, well, I don't know if you really desperately need this in order to achieve the requirement, or if this is just a get started guide. I quite like the phrase, actually, get started guide. So it will be useful to hear from our participants when they respond to the consultation, or just generally it'd be useful to hear, have we got that balance right now, or could some of that material actually move into educational guidance? What extra guidance is needed? And and because it's with the best will in the world, we all have different views on it, and often you find, particularly with standard setting, which you will probably know yourselves, is that despite the fact we want to scale it back a bit, we end up with requests for yet more. so we get one side of the coin, 25% of respondents who say there's far too much in this, scale it back, and then the other 75% gives a list of extra bits and pieces that they want us to think about. So it's a good question. It's a really important question, and so thank you for that.
Thank you. Can I just ask one question about the extent of EU involvement, if you like, in the process? I'm understanding that the EU have been observers, and the context for the question, which would be of interest to our audience, is that the European Commission need to adopt a sustainability standard in time. So, if you're able, Josephine, to the extent you can, just let us know to what extent the EU has you've been consulting with the EU or engaging with the EU on it.
Yeah, so they have, and there are various different people involved in the process, from obviously the European Commission and their role. And then we have some of the individuals like Sashka in EFRAG. And since we started, we have been interacting with various parties there, and then also they'll have representatives at the European Roundtable, which we have next week. I think Friday next week. So they'll be there as well to just help us through and help us understand where perhaps some of the issues might be and some of the challenges are for individuals who might be applying the standard and where we need to resolve those. But yes, very much engaged with the Commission and of course with EFRAG as well.
Mm-hmm. Very good, thank you. And there is there's a question there which points to ethics and requirements of ethics. You might just say a little bit about what's in the standard in relation to you know, the requirement for the ethical an ethical code and also a quality assurance standard. I mean, it says something at least as you know, similar, if you like, or at least equivalent to. Can you say a little bit more about that, perhaps particularly, you know, if it's auditors versus non-auditors?
Yeah, so all our standards, including 3000, which is used today by auditors, non-auditors, or so is also profession agnostic, are built on foundations, and those foundations are the ethical standards and having a quality, used to be a quality control, but now a quality management system in place. And they're essential because they're part and parcel of helping that engagement team deliver a high quality engagement. And of course, ethics, you know, you obviously need to be independent to deliver on a reasonable and limited assurance engagement. So they in any circumstance that you might have when you apply those standards, you have to have those you know, the ethical, you have to comply with the ethical standards, and you have to have your quality management system in place. But as with our current 3000 and 3410 and other related standards, it is or professional requirements or other requirements in law or regulation that are at least as demanding, because we have to recognize that jurisdictions may have, you know, their own ethical code. So the UK is a classic example. The UK has an ethical code, and it has its own, it's had its own development through history. But it is tested, and we do test it, and it is at least as demanding as the IAASB code. And so, you know, that is the standard in terms of ethics that has to be applied if you're performing assurance engagements or audit engagements in the UK. And, you know, and there'll be similar situations across other countries. And when we had, I think we had our global roundtable on Wednesday last week in New York, we had a couple, we had actually more than two. We had some participants from the non-audit firms, and it didn't at that stage, that didn't seem to faze them. They have their own, they were talking about their own quality management standards that they have to apply when they do any of the work they do. And they consider those at least as demanding. But ultimately, it's from a standard setter's perspective, which we are, this is what we say is foundational, and they're principles that have to be applied. But we do, of course, respect that it's up to the jurisdiction to determine what they believe would be at least as demanding.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Right on time. I'm seeing 3 o'clock on the clock. So I think as we approach the hour mark, I think I will bring the webinar to a close with a special thanks to Josephine and all the IAASB team, to TK, to Dan, to Fadi. I think we've had a really engaging webinar and gained some really valuable insights. I think we'd really like to encourage people to engage with your consultation, with the IAASB consultation. You know, and Josephine, as you've outlined, you've made it really easy for people to engage with this and to share their perspective. So, you know, if not in the template, then in the survey. And I think it's also worth mentioning that you do have some very valuable resources there complementing it. You know, I point people to the explanatory memorandum. You know, there's quite a bit there in terms, you know, well worth digesting about background and context. So thank you very much. And with that, I will conclude the webinar and wish everyone a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.